Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second debate or panel of today's conference. I hope that this will be not just a debate, but a very reflective account of developments of the overarching theme, the tension between religious freedom and equality in continental Europe. On this panel, we have three speakers, and I would introduce those in the order they shall speak today. Andrea Pin is an assistant professor of constitutional law at the University of Padua, Italy, and he also lectures comparative public law in that university. He has lectured on interethnic law in the Catholic University of Milan and has collaborated on various projects in Italy and internationally. He also clerks to the Supreme Court Justice Marta Cartabia since 2011. Married Jantera-Jareborg is a professor of law at Uppsala University in Sweden, where she was a dean in the Faculty of Law from 2004 to 2008. She has research interests in private international law, international civil procedure, and her paper today would provide a comparative overview of the way same-sex unions have been developed within the legal framework of Scandinavian countries. And Rocco Buttiglione is a professor of political science in St. Pius University in Rome. He's also a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Buttiglione will provide an overarching perspective, theoretical perspectives on the current debates regarding tension between religious freedom and equality. To pick up from something Christopher McCrudden addressed through his paper, the need of internal equality debates rather than religious freedom vis-a-vis equality challenge is a very important aspect of the conversation, and was picked up, the need of such debate, internal debate, was picked up a few years ago by Oliver and O'Donovan in a book called The Way Forward, Christian Voices on Homosexuality in the Church. In his text, Oliver O'Donovan suggests that the debate occurs when people take up their arguments, the arguments that others have raised against them, and try to give serious answers. To do this, they must think their opponent mistaken, certainly, but not wholly foolish or malicious. And the debate about equality, the tension between equality and religious freedom cannot happen while there is still a struggle for rhetorical dominance, which is to say that we want to take over the other side's perspectives through rhetorical dominance rather than through listening and trying to participate in engaging conversation through which we could find perhaps a common denominator, agree on certain points and disagree on others. Hopefully this particular session would help us to pitch the debate in continental Europe, and without further ado I will give the opportunity to Andrea to make his presentation.
I have to apologize because I just arrived from Italy, so my English is very rusty. And since I'm Italian, I talk with hands. I hope you will get familiar with that. And lastly, since I come from a Catholic country and I lecture extensively in the south of the United States, I will talk as a Catholic with a Southern Baptist flavor about same-sex marriage, which makes my talk more predictable. But I'd like to sketch what's going on in the South and Europe as for the clash between same-sex couples' rights claim and religious freedom claims. I would say that the environment is very diverse. You have countries that have introduced clearly same-sex marriage, whereas other countries have introduced more moderate regulations for same-sex couples. They accorded them some rights, some of them simply accorded them some official recognition or some specific rights. So the environment is very, very heterogeneous. Though, and in particular my country, in 2009, clearly stated that there's no room for same-sex marriage according to the Italian Constitution. This is because of the text. The text doesn't explicitly say marriage is for men and for women, but we have this proposition that says marriage entails moral and legal equality of the spouses within legally defined limits to protect the unity of the family. And therefore, the court induced that moral equality of the spouses implicitly recognize that they are sexually different. So there's no room for same-sex marriage. Though the court stated there's room for same-sex couple rights. Moreover, same-sex couples should be recognized some sort of legal protection because there are a sort of unions that must be accorded some rights, since constitutional text, our constitutional text gives rights to any social relationships. The problem we have is the same problem that other countries have. And I will rely heavily on someone else's speech because when I was drafting the paper, I thought I was making my homework. And then I realized that Professor McRudden has done my homework too. So I'm sorry, but I will refer to what he said. And I think there are many coincidences. I will address the 3 points. Not all my paper. I'm not going to read my paper. My paper is more boring. To make me talk about my paper, it makes people laugh. So I get it's more funny. I wouldn't say that the right way to assess, to strike the balance between same-sex marriage claim and religious freedom claim is the objection of conscience or some sort of accommodation. Coming to what Bishop Natalia mentioned yesterday, there are good reasons to prevent Catholic families from giving their children an education that contemplates same-sex couples as unnatural. And there's room for preventing Catholic families from adopting children since they don't agree with same-sex couples adopting. I'm not saying I'm sharing this view, but I'm saying that there's a constitutional ground for that. I'm going to show you, I hope I can show you why. The vast majority of Southern Europe countries that introduced some sort of legal protection for same-sex couples, regardless of the kind of protection they accorded to them, didn't explain why. They didn't give any real reason for endowing same-sex couples with the same rights of heterogamous marriage or endowing them with other rights, with different rights. So what you have is a marriage with no apparent reasons other than textual reasons. A second-class pact for same-sex couples with no reasons that can explain why they have, say, a different set of rights. And sometimes you have the same right for both, and it's hard to find a reason for which they accord the same right to both classes of couples. This is because equality principle and self-determination tend to trump the debate. And if you have a text that says no room for same-sex marriage, it will trump the debate about the same-sex marriage, but at the same time, it will pave the way for same-sex couples' rights. I would say that there's no room for any other argumentations. And this transforms the debate on same-sex marriage into a debate on the reasons for banning same-sex marriage. So people who oppose same-sex marriage should explain why, rather than people endorsing same-sex marriage being forced to explain why they want to expand the category of marriage to include same-sex couples. And I would say that at least 3 arguments could be made and that are seldom made. I mentioned them. The first would be tradition. Now I'm coming to the suggestions that were given by Tom Farr. Tradition, not in itself, but there's huge use of tradition when one refers to polygamy. It's very common to find scholars in the jurisprudence referring to the long-standing Western tradition of marriage as opposed to polygamy. But tradition doesn't work in the same way when one comes to same-sex marriage. So if you will find many people saying, we have gone a long way, we have realized that there's no room for polygamy, but for same-sex marriage, that's vice versa. Tradition is a sort of limitation. The second is feminism. A part of the feminist thinking has stressed the idea that women have a special role in society and in law. And a huge part of the debate around same-sex marriage disregards sex, doesn't take into account the difference of sexes. Sexes are irrelevant. And it seems to be that it's a betrayal of that part of feminism. The third, I'm quite brutal. Within 15 minutes, you can shoot me. I'll be glad to be your target later. And the third is morality. Not because morality has something to do with the shaping of law, but conversely, because rights are usually believed to be good. There's an extensive debate about exceptions in Spain, in Italy, and Germany, in Austria too, about what can be accorded to Catholic families since they don't agree with the new way of rights. And there's a large opinion that says that there's no room for exceptions because rights are good. So you can object in the sense that you're not requested to perform that right, but you are requested to teach your children that the rights are good. That's why there's room for denying Catholic families a special education to their children, Because when you enforce a right, that right is morally treated as good. And there's a second reason for where I'm coming to the end. There's a second reason to believe that there's no room for religious objections. We have similar we have similar episodes in Italy. The objection of conscience basically states that you can restrain from doing something that you should do as long as this doesn't impair other people's rights. We have similar rules in Italy regarding abortion. So physicians can object and not perform an abortion. But now we have up to 70% of physicians that don't want to perform an abortion. And now we have an increasing wave of scholars who say that the right is the right to perform an abortion, to have an abortion performed. So in case there's a conflict and the right cannot be granted, the objection of conscience is recessive. So equality and new rights win over exceptions. I'm coming to a conclusion. That's surprising. I would say that we cannot transform the arguments that can be used before, in the debate, before introducing same-sex marriage and same-sex couples' rights, into reasons to object, because they have a totally different status. Once you have a new right, there's a smaller room, there's narrower room for the objection of conscience, for the same reasons that you had when you were debating. So I agree with Professor McRudden when he said equality and new rights, I would say, versus religious liberty. Well, we'll see that equality and new rights win. And what I would say is that the introduction of new rights deserves more debate, because it's not true that this doesn't come at the expense of anybody. There's new balance among rights once you have same-sex marriage or any other rights. And finally, I would say that these issues are not so much divisive. What is divisive is the long list of decisions that were taken without considering all the debates, all the arguments that can be brought about. So what is really divisive is having thin decisions for thick issues. I will stop here, so at least you will remember me because I was short. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping up to the tight schedule. And may I now invite Marit to give her presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you so much for this kind invitation. I feel very honored by it. My paper, which is quite extensive, deals with the Scandinavian perspective on homosexuality and equal rights. And it gives a panorama of the developments in this area in the 5 Scandinavian states in a broad sense of the word, that is Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. Now, I will not be taking all your time by going through my paper, but only trying to focus on some of the issues which I describe in the extensive paper. I understand that to very many of you, the Scandinavian developments are the horror story, where you simply do not want to end or see happening at any stage. But I would wish to claim that nothing is really black and white, and that in my view there is also some degree at least of accommodation taking place in the Scandinavian countries. Now, generally speaking, since the invitation to this conference had in my mind quite a lot of a polarization, which to me was a novelty. I had never really thought in those terms that we have clashing rights. I noticed how very much one is the product of one's own legal environment and also religious environment. All the 5 Scandinavian states are evangelic Lutheran states. These states also, or the churches are national Volkschurches, by which could also be meant that there are very special ties with the state. Only in Sweden has the state-church separation being carried out, but still the Church of Sweden enjoys special privileges in relation to the other faith communities in Sweden. The other Nordic states still have the state-church combination. Second, what I think is important to mention is that the great majority of the Scandinavians in each of the states belong to their national state. And that is not some sort of ethical belonging. You in fact, to be a member, you pay a rather considerable church fee based on your income level. Now, in the Scandinavian debate on homosexuality, the focus has really been on anti-discriminatory concerns. Simply the outlook that homosexuals as a group are highly exposed, a vulnerable group, collective, which risks being discriminated and subjected to expressions of hate. It is this hate kind of a surrounding, and we haven't really linked too much protection of homosexuals to religious concerns. And this means that the religious dimension in the Scandinavian debates on this issue is absolutely present in the debates, but it has not been regarded as a true legal concern. For me, this emphasis on religious rights in the way many of you have been reasoning has been a very refreshing novelty. Now, if I say a few words of the Scandinavian developments which I describe in my paper, as I am sure you know in a certain sense, the legal recognition, the movement of recognizing same-sex couples as a couple, in fact, starts in Scandinavia. The first country to introduce legislation on registered partnerships is Denmark. This is 1989. And in the following years, all the other Scandinavian states simply joined. And all introduced the institution of registered partnership. Well, in the Scandinavian legal landscape, registered partnership was only and still is only aimed for same-sex couples who cannot marry or could not marry. So it was kept distinct from marriage. And there were quite a lot of differences because it was simply so radical, and the religious concerns were the dominating ones, why we were not talking about same-sex marriage in the early days, but of registered partnerships. And then, of course, when you start, it easily happens that it moves along, and then we got the same-sex marriages. That happens first in the Netherlands, and Spain, Belgium, and so on. But then come in the Nordic camp, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. And parallelly, or in fact before the introduction of the same-sex marriage concept, we have had a development of gradually introducing full parental rights to same-sex couples. It starts by stepchild adoptions, then joint adoptions, then artificial reproduction services, and so on. And in Norway, in fact, the lesbian woman's consenting partner is ex lege the co-mother of a child that is born after an artificial reproduction treatment. Well, the other focus in my paper, where I would say one really sees quite a lot of the accommodation concerns, is that we have in the Nordic countries a state funding system of faith communities based on the ideology that religious activities are good for the society. But we also have, and that is in particular in Sweden, very interesting cases testing the extent of freedom of expression, freedom of religion, when very strong negative statements are made against homosexuals. One of these cases is mentioned also in your draft religion handbook. It's on the Pastor Green case, and I will return to that. And then there is a new one now that was the judgment came just on 9th February from the European Court of Human Rights. It's Veiteland and others versus Sweden. It's also, in fact, on the freedom of expression and what are you permitted to say on homosexuality. But going now to the core issues, in Uppsala, my home university, I am the other director of a religious center of excellence, multidisciplinary, very much law and legal, law and religion connections. And we have had a lot of discussions on what is really freedom of religion, and what is it that qualifies for protection in the European national constitutions and according to the European Convention on Human Rights, which is extremely important here in Europe. And in fact, I would want to say that there is an enormous confusion among all of us, lawyers, theologians, whatever. And the issue is really whose freedom of religion, why, how, and by whom, and who decides what is religion to be protected, the believers, the faith communities, the state, and so on. And also, why do we then emphasize so much this positive freedom of religion? What about the negative aspect that is also protected by constitutions and the European Convention, namely not to have any religion at all? Now, if these two clash, equal rights and religious rights, equal rights in the Scandinavian discourse are very much in this context linked with the equal dignity of all human beings. And that no discrimination may take place on the basis of a person's sexual orientation. Now, of course, everything is vague, and we can legitimately have different opinions. What is what? But if we are discussing equal rights, one example is that if we, for example, in Sweden had registered partnerships for homosexuals, and had removed all exceptions as regards right to parenthood. Why did then homosexuals and others claim the right to same-sex marriage? Because on the level of rights, there was simply nothing which differed the one from the other. But then we get into the discussion that this is simply, when you call the one and the other another thing, it is not of the equal worth. So this was in fact the main argument in Sweden, Norway and Iceland when registered partnership as an institution was abolished and we moved to same-sex marriages. Now, regarding the concerns of religion in this respect, it has, every time a law amendment has taken place, it has been discussed in all the preparatory works to legislation, in the law commission's works. And regarding now what many have here expressed, I noticed that these kinds of concerns in our discussion have been labeled in the Law Commission reports as moral panic concerns, which do not qualify to be protected as religion, such as alleged devaluation of marriage and traditional family life, seduction of youth, societal decadence, and so on. This has really been discussed, but it has always been dismissed. And then on the other hand, there is the emphasis that faith communities remain in charge of the content of faith. And faith communities cannot be obliged to embrace anything contradictory. And of course we get a weighing of interest, which interests weigh the heaviest. Now, in my fellow panelist papers, civil servants' religious objections are given quite a lot of concern. I haven't seen that ever in the Scandinavian debate. We focus, in fact, on the faith communities' freedom of religion and their officials' freedom of religion. And of course, in a Scandinavian kind of legal setting, what you have are the majority churches. These are the national churches of each of the country, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and then you have the minority churches. And of course, these churches, when they discuss religion, are also in completely different societal positions. And their members have I believe, totally different expectations on also the content of faith. So even if all of the churches, including the majority churches, have initially been strongly opposed to registered partnerships and also naturally to same-sex marriages, they have been overrun. And after that loss in the debate, they have been, to a certain extent, willing to accommodate. And the most far-reaching examples here are the churches of Iceland and the Church of Sweden, which both simply have made the decision that same-sex marriage is okay from the church's point of view. Both these national churches also changed their marriage liturgy once the decision was taken to introduce same-sex marriage concept. And in Sweden and in all the Scandinavian countries, it is openly admitted that you can have two different notions of marriage, one for the faith communities, one for the state legislature. And we have a system where faith communities officiate marriages. Now, lastly, I would want to say a few words about the Pastor Green case, which has received quite a lot of international publicity. In fact, Green had a good point, even if he was made to sound as a monster or an old fool. He simply felt, I believe, that in the Scandinavian discourse, the emphasis is purely on the anti-discriminatory aspects of homosexuals, and that aspects of faith are missing. But if you read his sermon, you notice also that the language he uses is vulgar. He talks about cancer growths on society, on sexual intercourse with children and animals, and so on. And that offended, I think, the general public very much. Yet, in the end, Pastor Green was acquitted of all charges, and I think on good grounds, because simply there is a European standard, and his message was delivered. I think this is important in a religious surrounding in a Pentecost church. Now, the other case shows, I think, the European limits, the Wegeland and others versus Sweden, where we have a group of young men going into a Swedish high school, and they're distributing pamphlets where the message was exactly the same as in Pastor Green's sermon. They were committed for agitation against homosexuals, and now the European Court of Human Rights has said that there was no violence of the freedom of expression on behalf of Sweden. But I think these cases are different, and I would believe that the Pastor Green case would have been decided in the same manner in the European Court of Human Rights too. And I believe that the European Court of Human Rights and the Convention is extremely important in Europe to achieve a balance. Thank you very much.
And now I would like to give the opportunity to our last speaker on this panel to give his presentation.
Thank you. Before I start with my presentation, I must make a confession, not only one, three. I am an Italian, and you know that Italians are always too talkative. I am a professor, and I am a politician, and professors and politicians too speak always way too much. So I empower our president to take the floor out of me when it thinks fit.
I'll do my best.
Just give me a warning, a couple of minutes before you tell me that's enough. Enough is enough. And then a second for a warning. There is a small mistake in the presentation that you find here, and yes, repeated. Yes, it is true. It's a confession again. For a short period in my life, I have been a political scientist. I confess. But the most part of my life was dedicated to the more honorable business of political philosophy. So I prefer to be considered as a political philosopher in the Internationale Académie für Philosophie rather than in other universities. Now, I am very thankful for this invitation to come here, and also for the questions that you have given to me, and that have been really a fruitful starting point for my reflection. I wish to remember them, and I shall follow their order in the presentation. The first question was, what are the moral and legal frameworks that govern tensions between claims for homosexual equality and for religious freedom? Before I answer, I wish to make what the Germans would call a metacritic of the question. You ask a question, and this question presupposes the truth of a certain number of presuppositions that sometimes are not true. And if you consider those presuppositions not to be true, then it may be difficult to give a meaningful response to the question you are asking. Now, it seems to me that in the current discussion on homosexuality and also on rights in general, there are many points that need to be clarified. Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno used to call this exercise a metacritique, and Jacques Derrida called it an exercise of deconstructionism. Let us make a little bit of deconstruction of this question, starting with homosexuality. What is homosexuality? Did you ever consider it? One intervention has pointed out the problem. Shall we say that homosexuality is nature, or that homosexuality is culture? There have been some who have widely diffused the news that a particular gene had been discovered that regulates homosexuality and the human race. And this argument of the natural ground of homosexuality has been repeated in the media very, very often. Very few people have taken the time to go and control whether it is true or it is not. But if you consult scientific literature, you will see that this claim has been disclaimed, that all controls made in this area did not confirm the scientific hypothesis that linked the homosexual behavior to the discovery of that particular chromosome in our DNA. Why is this important? Because, well, I'm not saying that homosexuality is not the result of some natural predispositions. I prefer to think, and it seems to me that this is the most plausible interpretation of the data that we possess now, that it is, as most human phenomena, a result of an interaction of natural and cultural elements. There are perhaps some biological predispositions, but there is also the effect of the cultural environment, and there is also the effect of the individual life story of each one of us. In this sense, I think we can categorize homosexuality as a lifestyle. A further element that leads us in this direction can be taken from ancient history. Take Greece. In Greece, homosexual behavior was widely accepted, also in Plato. Although what Greece considered to be homosexuality is quite different from what we call with the word homosexuality. Because Greek people, most Greek people, there were differences within Greek civilization, but most Greek people thought that homosexuality was convenient at a certain stage in human development and less convenient at a further stage. It was seen as a moment in the growth of the individual. What the homosexuality we're speaking about might also be called pedophilia to a certain extent in the Greek context. They thought it was good up to a certain age and under certain conditions, and it could become bad later. And they never thought of homosexual marriage. Didn't they think of it because they were against homosexuals? No, although their homosexuality is quite different from ours. Rather, they had an idea of marriage that was common among us until a few years ago. Take Plato. Plato says that homosexuals should get married. Of course, with women or with people of the other sex, in order to have children, to have somebody who takes care for them when they grow old, and in order to perpetuate the family, and in order to perpetuate the city. Marriage is a social institution that has a social function. This function is the generation of children and the education of children, an alliance between generations, an alliance between sexes, men and women, that produces an alliance between generations. And that was the way in which Plato saw the problem of homosexuality. And not only Plato, a large part of the Greek culture. The Romans had still a different idea. A part of the Roman world shares the same vision as the Greeks. Take, for instance, the well-known story of Antino and Emperor Adrian. But another part has a different vision. Then homosexual behavior is considered positive for those who have an active role in the sexual act, and negative for those who have a passive role. Those who have a passive role are effeminated, and it's something that is convenient for slaves, not for free men. A free man can indulge to homosexual behavior, but only on the active side. And this you find a similar evaluation in most macho cultures. We cannot deal at length with these issues, but I only quote them to confirm the affirmation homosexuality is a lifestyle. And if it is a lifestyle, it can be the object of a legitimate moral judgment. It is not just like the fact of being born black or white, or in any other of the possible colors human races has examples of. It is a behavior, and all human behavior may be the object of a legitimate moral judgment. I do not fully agree with the Spanish bishop who has said recently that all homosexuals will go to hell. Monsignor Tartaglia could teach us that in order to have a sin, you need to have, well, a grave matter, and homosexuality is surely an important matter, but you need also to have full consciousness of what you are doing, and you must be morally free to do or not to do that. And whether these two subjective elements occur is something human beings will never know. Only God sees the heart of man. So even if one admits homosexuality to be morally bad, which I have not grounded up to now, but even in this case, he is not bound to imagine that all homosexuals are bad people. The person is different from his or her actions. Thanks God. Otherwise, very few of us could have any hope of salvation. But in any way, it is important to have this clear: homosexuality is a lifestyle. And the individual person can be judged only by God. Also because if one is grown up in this lifestyle, it is very difficult for him to make a personal stand against the lifestyle in which he was reared. St. Thomas Aquinas would say that he stands in a situation of inevitable error. That is not a moral sin that cannot be considered as a moral responsibility or a moral liability. But a lifestyle can be the object of cultural evaluation. And then you can have a debate on homosexuality, saying this is right or this is wrong. And you have to give reasons for it being right or wrong. And you must also have a fundamental, and if you want to contain this discussion within a political community, then you must have also one principle, one fundamental principle: the respect of the dignity of the other, who has good reasons to defend his position, and who is not necessarily in bad faith, and who is not necessarily a bad man because he behaves in a way that is different from the way that I consider to be correct. We go then to an old principle, the principle of toleration. You remember Voltaire? I think that you are wrong, but I am ready to give my life in order that you may say what you think is true, or in order that you may live according to the principle you think are good. Toleration means respect of the dignity of the other and freedom to discuss his behavior and to say this is right, this is wrong. Where is the limit? A limit must be set. The limit, I think, is the incitation to violence against the other, or the devaluation not of the behavior, but of the person of the other. I respect you. Nevertheless, I think you are wrong. We live in a world in which there are different opinions, different visions of the world. We love other people. We are husbands and wives. We are fathers and children. We may have different attitudes in the same family. And nevertheless, the reciprocal love, the bond of love and respect, should remain untouched, as in the family, so also in the broader political community. A second observation regards the idea of discrimination. What is discrimination? Etymologically, discrimination comes from the Greek. You find at the root of the Greek word krino, krinein, that means to distinguish, to make distinctions. To discriminate is to pass judgments. And every moment in which you live, you pass judgments. Now, you, who are in front of me, in your mind are passing the judgment. Oh, how boring and full this Italian professor is. It is a legitimate judgment. And you cannot live if you do not pass judgments. So to say that all discriminations should be avoided, in the best case is an emphatical way of saying that all unjustified discriminations should be avoided. But this implies that there are justified and unjustified discriminations. There are justified and unjustified distinctions. If you want to preserve the word discrimination for unlegitimate discriminations, we can accept this language convention. But then you must never forget that there are legitimate distinctions. And whenever an issue of discrimination arises, I should ask the question, the peculiarity that is here being discriminated is relevant for this specific issue or not? The idea of discrimination goes back to the principle of equality or of justice, as stated by Aristotle. Aristotle says that it is equally wrong to treat in the same way different situations as to treat in different ways the same situation. Now, let us say, is the fact of being an homosexual or an heterosexual relevant for the qualities that are required in order to be the commanding general of an army? 2 minutes, oh my goodness. No. Is it relevant in order to be a bishop of the Catholic Church? Yes. I know that the criterion is not easy to apply, but it is a clear criterion. When we speak of discrimination, we can speak of discrimination in two ways. You may have an enlarged idea of discrimination or a restricted idea of discrimination. Many problems arise because sometimes we make use of the word in one sense, and we are understood as making use of it in the other sense. The enlarged idea of discrimination is incompatible with tolerance and leads to the idea that no judgments should be passed. And if we do not pass judgment, we lose the ability of making use of moral reason, or perhaps of reason as Dogeter. I stop here, but I hope that your question will allow me to tell you something more. Thank you.
Thank you. After Professor Buttiglioni's caveat, I was slightly terrified that I may be put in an awkward position to restrict his freedom of expression towards the end of his talk, but I'm pleased that this didn't have to happen. Thank you very much for all the three speakers, and we'll now open the opportunity for the audience to raise some questions. I was just wondering whether I could abuse my position and ask Mariette a question in connection with her fascinating presentation. I mean, what I find particularly fascinating about the Scandinavian accommodation laws is that they were in some way theologically driven, that there was really a project where the Lutheran churches in various Scandinavian countries had to review their theology and to some extent amend it. And in connection with that, I was just wondering whether you'd be prepared to push this further and tell us more whether this was really a theologically driven project or whether this was a state-driven theology. Did the initiative come through the Lutheran churches, or was there pressure from political pressure because of the inherent relationship between church and state in established religion context?
Thank you. Excellent question, and not completely easy perhaps to answer. Now as I mentioned, these are national churches, and you have the state church link there. And if you are the national church of the country, the Volkschurch, you are something for the whole population. That is the image at least. I think such a church needs to accommodate also what is going in society with the faith. And to my knowledge, these first investigations carried out by the Church of Sweden in the early 1970s on the topic homosexuality and Christianity were totally internal. And the reason was simply a lot of concerns that homosexuals felt that they were not included within the church community. And it's quite radical that an internal Swedish church report in 1974 ends recommending that the church blesses stable homosexual relationships. Then the later developments, of course, in a certain sense, closely mirror what is taking place in state law. And the big issue here is that since now the majority of the populations in the Scandinavian countries enter their marriages in church. The churches have full powers to officiate legally valid marriages. Well, then the churches again must follow the developments in society. And of course it was an issue, should the churches then give up the state power? So it was really necessary also from the internal point of view of the churches to carry on what I believe sincere in-depth analysis. Is it possible to combine the Word of Bible with these new societal trends and understandings, and final conclusion, love commandment is superior to everything else, which means that when we do least harm to those closest to us, that is what Christ wants of us, and therefore same-sex marriage is okay. This is a radical interpretation for many, but of course none of the Scandinavian churches are united in this understanding. It's left to each minister to decide.
Thank you very much. I would like to collect a few questions, a series of questions. I would encourage those who do their questions to be short and make short comments if they wish to do so instead. Cole Durham.
We were talking mainly about Volkskirchen and how they have developed. But then when you have Pastor Green, he's obviously in an independent Pentecostal, as I recall, but I can't remember exactly.
It's true.
And so now, I've read his whole sermon, and there are these scurrilous passages, but if you strip those out, they're basically, it's been a long sermon, like 67 passages from the Bible. I think that's the count. I mean, it's something like that, plus or minus 3. So if you just had the Bible passages and not the Cancer on Society and children's, what is how much protection should a sort of non-Volkschurch, one that might have a different view, how much freedom is there for that church to define its own theology and to speak it and even to call reporters and come and listen to the message as Pastor Green did. How does that work out when it's not the state church?
Well, as I think you have noticed, if you have read the Swedish different court judgments, it went through 3 cases. There are made references to the enactment of this provision in penal code sanctioning agitation against homosexuals, and in that connection the Pentecostal Church wanted to have clarification. Does this mean that citing from the Bible is suddenly prohibited when it is critical or condemning homosexuality? And I think these judgments also show in a sense that, okay, his statements exceeded what would be totally okay according to Swedish law, but on the other hand, it follows of the European Convention, which is part of Sweden's constitution, that you must be tolerant in this kind of a religious context. So I would believe that after this case, it wouldn't be a problem, since we haven't got any contradictory signals from the European Court on Human Rights. And what was said, he really developed his case very cleverly, and I think in a balanced way. And of course, you must be able to interpret the Bible, and that is what he aimed to be doing.
Gentleman in the front.
My name is Mike Davidson, Dr. Mike Davidson. I'm a trainee psychotherapist. A month ago, my membership in my professional organization was revoked, as was my trainee status. My attempt to take the matter further using professional indemnity insurance was denied. So I don't feel that my case, which wasn't arising out of a complaint from any client or any group, it arose out of the fact that I expressed the view that some people can move out of homosexuality and should be given the space to do that. That has been my journey for 30 years. I don't believe in this country, I think I would much rather come and live in Scandinavia, because in this country I'm not sure my case is even going to be heard. So I would just be interested to know how such a position would be treated in your countries.
Any comments from the panel?
Well, I know the case. I think in Italy, but I think also in the United States, because the United States have a leading position on this kind of issues. If anybody feels comfortable in being an homosexual, well, he's supposed to be perfectly okay. But if he feels uncomfortable and thinks that he is unhappy in this situation and he wants to change the situation, why should he not go to a psychotherapist? I think this is a very reasonable position, and I'm sad in learning that in the United Kingdom this is not accepted.
The United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, the largest professional body in the UK, says in its ethical guidelines that it is an ethical offence for any psychotherapist to reduce homosexual feelings, not even change. You may not ethically work with a client to reduce their homosexual feelings.
Excuse me, but very often in Italy, people, homosexuals, come to us saying, well, if one is a hidden homosexual, an homosexual who is not willing to take into account, to bring to consciousness his hidden homosexuality, he should be free to go to a psychotherapist to be helped. Why not? And if he happens to be uncomfortable with homosexuality, he should be able, on the same basis and for the same reasons. There is a clear contradiction to the principle of equality.
I was just wondering whether I could get back to Rocco Buttiglioni's definition that homosexuality is a lifestyle, and obviously, would you be prepared to consider the nature of this lifestyle in dialogue, or would you give it as a set perception of the lifestyle? Because it seems to me that even the perception of who am I and what is the nature of a homosexual relationship are not unified even within the internal gay discourse. So there are contemporary authors, for example, who, like Michael Vaz, who wouldn't take the view that marriage is an appropriate concept which would be able to represent a gay relationship, and they move more in direction of a fellowship. And similarly, in relation to identity politics, the internal discourse is quite divided in terms of what means to be homosexual, whether it's essentialist, whether it's a constructed identity. And obviously, how do you see this coming with the understanding that this is really a lifestyle, would be reconciled with the internal divisions with the gay discourse on those?
Of course, because it is an historical lifestyle. I have just made this attempt to bring history within the discourse. And the homosexual lifestyle is an historical lifestyle and changes in time. Homosexuality in the time of Plato is not homosexuality in our time. Homosexuality in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, let us say homosexuality before HIV is completely different from homosexuality today. Homosexuality was linked to the idea of the sexual revolution. Go to bed with as many people possible, and it was a kind of sexual liberation. You could find very few homosexuals who did not adhere to the ideology of free sex and the sexual revolution. With this tremendous disease, there is a terrible change, a break in the mentality of the homosexual community, and many start trying to set up partnerships more or less based on faithful sexual behavior, which, by the way, morally should be evaluated from a Catholic point of view, should be considered as a positive evolution. Although there is the ground why we have all these problems with the homosexual marriage, because in the other age, nobody would have dreamed of asking for marriage for homosexuals. Why? Now there is a demand. Is this a demand that covers the whole of the homosexual community? No. Let us say it frankly. When you have introduced homosexual marriage, how many homosexuals have gotten married? I shall tell you, very few. And these marriages did not last for long. And why? Because marriage is an institution that is centered neither upon the husband nor upon the wife, but upon the child. It is an institution created in order to protect the child. Matrimonium comes from the Latin, munus matris. It is the area that protects the mother. No mother, no marriage. And that's the reason why we should be more attentive to the fact that the real problem is not homosexual marriage. It's marriage. What is marriage? Are we losing the idea of what marriage really is? We are not begetting children anymore. And of course, if we lose the idea that marriage is centered on children, then where does the difference lie between an homosexual couple and an heterosexual couple? There is no difference. Then why don't we call marriage the relationship of the one and also of the other? We can go this way, but this way has consequences. That is, that our so-called Western civilization will disappear because we will not have children. That's, by the way, what is already taking place. You cannot consider the problem of homosexuality if you do not put it within the general context. By the way, if it is a lifestyle, it can propagate itself. If it is a natural fact, then the number of homosexuals will remain the same throughout history. if it is a lifestyle, it can grow. And its growth will have as a consequence that our children will be taken into this lifestyle. And the number of children in the future will become less and less. Are we prepared to say, well, it does not matter because children can be not procreated, but it can be made, just as you made robots? Are we ready to make this step? We should discuss these issues. I think the discussion on homosexual marriage way too poor and restricted to elements that do not grasp the real importance of the issue.
Lady in the corner and gentleman here.
Yes, I'm taking up maybe on some of your points. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm Patricia Morgan. I'm a freelance researcher and author. I wanted to take up some points with Marit here because I did a book actually on Swedish social policy a few years ago. In Sweden, I don't know much about the other Scandinavian countries, I've got to say that, but Sweden in structure is a very authoritarian country with top-down direction of people, and you had that for decades, and for decades you've had this movement to empty marriage. You know, it was interdependence was wrong, so people couldn't rely on one wage, so the taxes and the welfare system eliminated that. Children had to be reared outside a relationship in public provisions. That's been modified a little bit recently in the sense that mothers get big parental leave payments, so you call it a career break rather than motherhood. You know, it's a better job for a while. But we have this emptying of marriage in Sweden. Obviously the unwed birth rate is extremely high, the marriage rate is not very high. So what are you giving homosexuals? Essentially air, aren't you? There's nothing really left there. And as you said, it is just something maybe a convenience for two people. They like the idea. It's not to rear children, it's not for interdependence. So when we get to that stage, is that when we have gay marriage? Because we just say, take the leavings.
Should I answer this? Your way of looking at Sweden is not totally uncommon, but very many people would not at all agree with the connotations you link with. Pardon?
I was told by many Swedes when I did my book that you have stripped us bare.
It depends. Others might say that it has been very good for women that both spouses need to be on the labor market, that you create equality in marriage. You have an excellent childcare system where your children are highly stimulated. You can also look at things from that point of view, but so in that sense, I don't agree at all with you regarding Sweden, and fathers also are very engaged in bringing up their children and sharing these long maternal leaves that you mentioned. But you have a point in saying that Sweden has had a tendency of emptying marriage of its content, in the sense that the ideology since the sexual liberation in the 1960s and any legislation since early 1970s has been that the state legislator should be neutral to the choices of the individual, how to conduct his or her life, and whether to marry or to remain unmarried and have children outside of marriage, and that the legislation should not make these choices difficult for people. It should not, from the legal perspective, be that relevant whether you marry or decide not to marry. Now there are people today who say in Sweden that in fact the claim by homosexuals to have the right to marry, to receive this highest connotation, to the relationship, in fact, gives marriage content. It makes it into something desirable, that in that sense it has strengthened marriage. What is offered to same-sex couples is this highest equal worth of marriage label in this context, yes.
Yeah. Can I group a few questions towards the end of this discussion? This gentleman here, Chris McCrudden, and the lady at the back.
Dermot O'Callaghan from Ireland. I hope the next 3 questions will go to Andrea because he's been left out. But I'm afraid
I'm lazy.
I have another question for Mary. I have another question for Mary in respect of Denmark. You said that from 1989 there were civil partnerships and now there's same-sex marriage in Denmark. There's now a huge database of people, heterosexual and homosexual, who are married. And research has been done on that database. And the extraordinary outcome of that research is that the way that children are reared can have a major determining effect on whether they will marry a man or a woman. Now, I wonder whether the reality of that has sunk into the legal community, and I wonder whether you accept it yourself.
Christopher McCrudden.
You'll be glad to know it's a question for everyone. So I'm sort of puzzled because the question about, I suppose my question really is about the relationship between civil marriage and religious marriage. So a lot of what is being said in defense of marriage would certainly encapsulate and explain why religious communities have marriage. And in that respect, I would entirely understand and indeed in many cases support that. The puzzle is the question about what the relationship is between the religious conception of marriage and the civil conception of marriage, the state conception of marriage. And that seems to me quite a deep puzzle, because there's an assumed relationship that I'm not sure has been fully explored yet. And the question is this, and it's going to sound rather more aggressive than it's meant to sound. And that is, what exactly is the concern? Indeed, what even is the interest that religious communities who have a very clear conception of religious marriage have in the conception of marriage conducted by the state? Now, historically, we know that that the interest was close because the state effectively attempted to take over the notion of religious marriage and give an alternative, and that's understandable. The question that I'm raising really is, what's the current justification for the apparently close relationship between the two? And I raise it because clearly in some contexts, the British context being a classic example, the conception of civil marriage understands and builds into it a notion of divorce. Certainly the Catholic conception, which I share, does not have a conception of divorce. There is already a difference, therefore, between the two conceptions. Now, one of the puzzles maybe, and this is, I'll end on this point, one of the puzzles is, and I think probably one of the difficulties is, that at least the Catholic Church in England, and in Ireland as well, I think in Ireland as well, but I won't speak for Ireland, certainly in England, has a dual function. That is, that it carries out when, as I was married in a religious ceremony, the priest conducting the marriage not only conducts a religious marriage, but also a civil marriage. Now, I understand in that situation that there is an intimate relationship between the two. But what puzzles me is why, certainly in Catholic contexts, why the Catholic clergy have any role at all in carrying out civil marriages.
Lady at the back.
This issue that Christopher has just identified is central to what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, the relationship with civil and religious marriage. But my comment goes to, I guess, the first and third speakers on this, a couple points about marriage. The special role of women, the special role of gender roles, the special role as a child-rearing institution. And I was particularly struck with the final speaker's claim that the concept of marriage that was found back in antiquity was common until 50 years ago. This reflects a sort of ahistorical, frozen in time picture of what marriage is that really misses the major evolution, at least in civil law, of the role of women within marriage, you know, all sorts of different aspects of marriage. And I think that I really want to caution people about a frozen in time picture, that if we just went back to what we had 50 years ago, we have the same thing we had back in the time of the Greeks and the Romans. At the same time, the other half of that's very important. You know, with the Supreme Court cases in the United States, protecting the right to use contraception, the right to get abortions, and state law moving toward, you know, divorce, and also moving toward protecting children outside of marriage through breaking down the distinction between marital and non-marital children. There is kind of a legal and cultural issue, which is we say marriage is a primary institution for child rearing. Many Americans don't believe that. Many Americans think having children is not a very compelling reason to get married. The millennial generation apparently feels that becoming a parent is an important part of a good life, but getting married is not necessarily an important part of a good life. So we have these kind of cultural changes and legal change about the content of marriage. And I guess what I'm concerned about is whether these papers, the first and third anyway, really reckon with the change in what marriage is as a matter of civil law over time. And as to this gender point, you know, at least in the US, there's been a major transformation of family law, which has been called the gender revolution, moving away from fixed roles, hierarchy, to equal partnership, both as spouses and parents. What I hear you talking about, particularly in feminism, there may be a kind of relational feminism or difference feminism, but for the most part, you know, the Equality Project in family law has been kind of moving away from fixed roles.
Thank you very much. And may I now invite the three panelists to address this group of questions. Perhaps give Andrea the opportunity to shine.
Yeah. Okay.
We already did.
Yeah.
Once again.
Once again.
Do you want me to be the first or the last? So, because I think they're most concerned with what Rocco said. I don't know.
You're more than happy to address any of the questions which have been raised, if you wish to do so.
We only want to listen to you.
Yeah. Okay. I would say basically three things. Why civil marriage matters for religious purposes. Well, the implications that civil marriage has for religious communities are clear from what Bishop Tartaglia mentioned yesterday. And I think that the implications derive from the fact that marriage is believed to be a fundamental right. And since it's a fundamental right, it should be concretely and ideally protected. If you modify the shape of marriage, you will have several implications. No matter if it's civil or it's civil plus religious. I would say so that you will have, you don't have a marriage which is a matter of rights, but you have rights that derive from marriage. So if you switch the category of marriage, or if you expand it, you have more rights arising, or different rights arising. The second reason for saying that civil law is something important for the Catholic thinking, well, that's because marriage is a civil institution for Catholics. You cannot simply get married in your church and stay within the celibacy outside. You must have good reasons to do that. So let's say there's a religious reason. Bishop Tarkaya will ask me, why don't you want to become married before the state, not just before myself? I'm sure. And on the other hand, you have civil and state reasons. The second point is roles. Well, I didn't want to talk about roles, like female role or male's role, but the fact that the identity of the two is irrelevant doesn't have only to do with roles. We might debate about that. It's not a matter of roles only. The third, and I'll conclude, so you recall my name because I'm fast. The third is that there's a funny tale, because in Belgium, in the 19th century, they had just the religious marriage. So they wanted to have people celebrate the marriage before the state. So they introduced the civil marriage. But no one bothered about that. They didn't give a damn about that. So they kept celebrating their marriage. And everybody knew that they were married because they were all Catholic then. Then they imposed a new law saying, you first celebrate your civil marriage, then you get to this religious marriage. Otherwise, there will be penal sanctions. So what you have now in Belgium is that you can live with your partner without getting married. You can get married before the state and before the church, but if you get married before the church, you will have sanctions. And this is demonstration that the historical proof that there's always been a communication between the two, the civil and the religious dimensions. I wouldn't go farther because I'm running out of time.
Yes, I just want to say that I understand the issue of civil and religious marriage, but I think that the real problem is civil marriage. Which kind of civil marriage do we want? Of course, I know that there has been a tremendous evolution in marriage from the time of Plato to our own time. But until 50 years ago, more or less, everybody was convinced that the center of marriage were children. There has been a tremendous evolution also in the last 50 years. But perhaps the time has come to make an evaluation of the results of this evolution. Was it for good? Was it for bad? Was it in part for good and in part for bad? I give you a few data. What is the main cause of poverty in the United States? Families in which there is only the mother and the father has left, has gone away. That is, the disruption of the family, the traditional family with one father and one mother, is the main cause of poverty in the United States. And I regret to say, in Italy too. We have made a research right now, and this has confirmed that the Italian pattern runs very close to the United States pattern. And what is the first cause also of criminality? Well, the same, the disruption of the family. Shall we say that there are no role differences within marriage? I give you only one personal experience. When my first child was born, by the way, also when the other children were born, I have had 4, well, I was stricken with the first, with the others I was already prepared, by the fact that the father for the child is a foreigner. You enter into the life world of the child only after 1, 2, 3 years, and you are introduced into this world by the mother. The mother tells the child that you are his father. He does not know. And the mother is the word of the child. The relation to the mother is different from the relation to the father. Can we dismiss this? Can civil law completely refuse to consider this? And last sentence, if you allow me. It is a political problem. If we go on not having children, who will pay for the pensions and the health care of the old people? We are very near to the collapse of state finances in all Western countries, without exception. The International Monetary Fund yesterday has issued a document telling us that if we go along this path, it is a demographic path, but it is a cultural path, because demography is an effect of culture, then we are lost.
Very brief comment.
Yes, now these legal developments in Scandinavia are mainly justified with the aim of creating social inclusion of homosexuals and an atmosphere of tolerance in society. So I didn't know about this Danish database. If this is true, that it has been proved that children's choice of future partner would be affected. Perhaps from a Scandinavian perspective, this is not a problem at all. If we are for social inclusion and tolerance and believe in equal worth. That would be my answer. But all the studies I know about that have been used in connection with the law reforms had a different message, that it could not be verified that it in any way affected the child's development.
This was a study of 2 million there, so that's it.
Okay.
The organizers have reminded me that despite this nourishing intellectual banquet, we also have to eat. Lunch is served at 1, and
can I just say, you need lunch tickets from Kyle over there, and on the ticket it says until 1:15, so you'll have 15 minutes to get there. And it will be, so don't just stay talking for half an hour and expect to get
so thank you very much to all the speakers for the session.